First off, thanks for coming to Tech Talk Live. This is episode 56, and today we will be talking about the Alfresco Mobile SDKs, which are soon to be released. And before we get going, I want to get some plugs out of the way. We do this every month, so the next month we will be doing this on Wednesday, August 1st, and it'll be the same time. We don't have a topic selected. I'm hoping we can do something on solar, but we'll see about that. So nothing is set, but definitely watch Twitter and watch the Tech Talk Live wiki page, and you can find out what we'll be doing next month. DevCon Berlin is coming up in November 6th and 7th. And then in San Jose, California, DevCon is the following week, November 14th and 15th. And if you are into mobile app development and Alfresco, you'll be happy to know that we have a pretty decent block of sessions happening at both DevCons around mobile. So some of these guys that we will be hearing from today are presenting at DevCon. Also, if you'd like to join us on Freenode IRC in #Alfresco, we have a pretty good group of folks that hangs out there and asks and answers questions and just chats about Alfresco, so please join us there. If you have questions during today's Tech Talk Live, as always, you can chat those into the WebEx. Or if you would rather tweet them, you can do that. I would ask that you use the #Alfresco TTL hashtag. And I guess if you want to ask questions in IRC, you can do that as well. So we're watching all of those channels. But the easiest thing is just to chat those into WebEx. All right, so with that, I would like to introduce Gavin Cornwell. He is a founding engineer at Alfresco. You've been here since day one, right, Gavin?
That's right, yep.
That's cool. And now you're leading up the mobile group, and you've brought with you two from your posse here, I guess, Peter and Jean-Marie. Peter is, should I assume Peter is working on the iOS part, and Jean-Marie, I know what you're working on. You're the Android guy.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
Cool. Well, I will turn it over to you guys, and as usual, I will be interrupting you at awkward moments during the talk to ask questions. And but other than that, I'm going to let you guys jump right into it.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff says, I'm going to start off, just got a few high-level slides to give a very high-level overview of why we've done the SDK, the mobile SDK, what it is, and how we've done it. And then I'm going to hand over to Jean-Marie, who's going to take you through some more detailed side of the Android SDK, and then finishing off with Peter, who's going to talk about the iOS SDK. So why have we done it? So basically to simplify access to Alfresco from mobile devices. So we have our own app that we're currently developing, and we're halfway through developing an Android app. And so to take away some of the pain of dealing with XML responses and JSON responses and the difference between 3.4 servers and 4.0 servers where bugs have been fixed, etc., we handle all that in the SDK for you. So it's fairly straightforward for you to get access to repositories from your mobile apps with just a few lines of code. So we've basically designed the API so that it's the same API regardless of the server that you access. So whether you're going against an on-premise 3.4 server or a recent 4.0 server or even the new cloud server, the APIs are actually different. The only bit that's slightly different is the way you create the session at the beginning. So we'll show a little sample app a bit later about how we've done that. So it's also, one of the other reasons for doing this is to enable third-party applications to integrate Alfresco. So there's a lot of great apps out there that link to Dropbox and other sort of online cloud providers. So obviously we want people to make use of the new cloud platform that we've released recently. So this would be a great way for people to integrate Alfresco into their mobile apps. And obviously customers and partners, if they're building their own internal Alfresco-based apps, again, this would help build apps in a rapid way, as I've put there. And also, obviously, this is going to be the basis of all of our future mobile apps that we build. So any sort of common functionality that we have between apps will be added into the SDK. So the capability of the SDK will grow over time. So what is in the SDK? So at the moment, we've got an iOS SDK, mobile SDK and an Android SDK. So they're obviously built on top of the SDKs from the mobile providers. So we've added on top a client API which allows you to get access to the repository. On the end, so that's common across the iOS one and the Android one. On Android, the sort of the low-level client API is a synchronous API. And we've split out the handling of the asynchronous calls into a separate library, which Jean-Marie will go into a bit more detail about why we've done that a bit later. And then the third green box there is just to represent there's a whole raft of stuff that we can add in the future, loads of other sort of APIs that will help developers build apps quickly. In the SDK, you'll also get a sample app, which will give you ideas of how to build the app using our SDK, so it's obviously built on top using those APIs. And we will be seeing some demos of those a bit later. And on the Android side, for the first release, there's a UI library with some reusable widgets. So we've got some pre-built UI for you to display activities and browse repository, for example. So that capability will be coming in a future release for the iOS side. As I mentioned, sample apps, so just a couple of quick screenshots to show you that does actually exist, and as I say, we'll see some demos of that a bit later. So how have we done it? We have a CMIS on the Alfresco repository. Obviously, everybody's familiar with Alfresco. So we have a REST API and the CMIS API. So where possible, we use CMIS for the API calls, but for things like sites and comments and tagging, for example, they fall outside of the CMIS realm. So we're using the Alfresco REST API for that. So the client API wraps the CMIS library. So on the Android side, we're wrapping Open CMIS essentially. So Jean-Marie's done a little bit of work to tweak the standard open chemistry project to allow Android use of the standard Open CMIS. So the next release of the chemistry library will have Android support in it. And we've built, or in the process of building, a similar library for Objective-C. So we've had a couple of external people helping with that as well, and that's a project that we'll be contributing. Peter will go into a bit more detail about that a bit later. So just a very high-level class diagram of what we have in the API, in the client, in the SDK, I should say. This represents the client API piece. So on the left, you have your session objects, which is how you sort of the entry point to the SDK, and then there's a bunch of services that you can call to get to various functionality within the repository, and then all the boxes on the right-hand side represent all the model objects that you get back as a result of calling the service objects. So that slide just reiterates what I've just said, really, and the fact that we handle all the asynchronous calls for you. So in your app, you don't need to worry about the threading aspect of making sure stuff's done on a background thread. And again, that's done differently on Android and iOS, so Peter and Jean-Marie will go into those in detail, I'm sure. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Jean-Marie. He's going to take you through the Android SDK in a bit more detail.
So before Jean-Marie gets going, I just want to mention to everyone that we're recording this session, And so the recording of the session will be available after it's over. It's usually within 24 hours. And then slides we will also make those available as well. So no worries there.
Okay. Hello everyone. I hope there's a lot of Android fanboy. So before starting presenting Alfresco SDK, I want to take a couple of minutes to present basic notions and architecture of an Android application. So if you pass an Android application in X-Ray, the app is composed into 4 main parts. First, Android activities. An activity represents the presentation layer of an Android application. A simplified description is that an activity represents a screen in your Android application, but it can be also displayed as dialogues or even can be transparent. An Android application can have several activities, and internally there's a stack of activities. So when moving from one screen to another, the next activity to be visible is pushed onto the top of the stack. In other words, the activity on the top of the stack is what is visible on the display. The activity is composed by what is called fragments. Simply, fragments are portions of user interface. It's possible to combine multiple fragments in a single activity to build a multi-pane user interface and reuse a fragment in multiple activities. You can think of a fragment as a modular section of an activity, which has its own life cycle, receives its own input elements, and which you can add or remove while the activity is running. Next, loaders. Loaders gives the developer a mechanism of loading data asynchronously for an activity or fragment. Indeed, for an lengthy operation, like loading data from a data source, working on the user interface thread is a very bad option. Moreover, if the data is being loaded over the network, then the latency is something that cannot be predicted. The common design pattern used for this problem is to create an asynchronous task and hand over the data loading task to it. Loader provides the exact same feature with a well-defined and simple API. Finally, services. Services is a well-known concept and don't really a detailed explanation, except that this layer is responsible to manage all the information inside your application. So with those 4 parts, you have a typical Android application architecture. And guess what? We follow the same way for implementing our Android Mobile SDK. So what Alfresco Mobile SDK provides? It's simple. We provide 4 projects that match the 4 main parts that I explained. First, the foundation services. It's where all the logic is. It's where we provide Alfresco services like document folder services, seed service, etc. That are responsible to create high-level object, document, folder, or seeds. Next, because services are synchronous, we need a layer to make all those things asynchronous. The asynchronous API, based on Android loaders object, is responsible for this task. Each service has 1 or more loaders that make those methods asynchronous. The user interface component library is a bunch of fragments, adapters, and managers that make creating user interface really easy. List of activity, list of seeds, list of comments are the kind of ready-to-use fragment that this library provides. Finally, the sample application demonstrates how it's possible to use all those layers into one complete application. So you have maybe understand, but the SDK is not just one project. It's a stack of different projects. From the foundation services based on Android OpenCMIS at the bottom to the Alfresco applications at the top. Each layer is important and provides essential methods and data. OpenCMIS provides CMIS support and all foundation services. Alfresco extension allow developers to have access to Alfresco aspects. The repository API provides a mix between Alfresco specific services and CMIS services. The asynchronous, of course, makes all of them asynchronous. The user interface library displays those information, and of course, the application manages the user interaction with all these services. The foundation services can run and work in the majority of Android versions, while the user interface part runs since honeycomb version. Indeed, fragments and loaders are available only since honeycomb. It explains why the top of the stacks works only on those platforms. But before typing question, you can ask me why this obvious discrimination is present, for two main reasons. First, as you may know, here at Alfresco, we are focusing our mobile strategy to tablet devices. In Android world, tablet devices are supported since Android version 3, alias honeycomb. So to provide the best experience we can to our users, we have chosen to provide the best experience we can. Second reason, we want to make developer life simple, and to reach this goal, we have to use the most simple components that Android provides. In other terms, loaders and fragments. For those who have used loaders and async tasks, for example, you may know the difference of behavior during, for example, screen rotation. But because there's always a but in this kind of situation. If you are familiar with Android development, you may know it exists what is called an Android compatibility library. This lib has the particularity to enable some concept to previous version of Android. And of course, it's the case for fragment and loaders. So we don't provide SDK support for Froyo and Gingerbread, but it's really easy to transform the current project to support them with the Android support library. I made the test, and in less than a few hours, it's possible to do the works. The majority of refactoring is just to use the support package provided by the lib. So, if you want to create a phone application, don't hesitate. Now, I want to make a focus on the user interface library. In Android, it's possible to have what is called a library project. It allows to store source code and common resource, which is used by several other Android projects. Indeed, resources are very important in Android, because Android doesn't respect the pattern one device to fit them all. You have to provide a collection of image, string, or layered resource to match each version of your Android device. The UI library provides to you all those data at no cost. So, for example, we provide icons image for file type, seed, or different types of activity in different size. So, whatever the density or the size of your screen device, there's a resource for it. We also provide localization resources, theme, and of course, fragment. Okay, it's enough for theory. Let's start some practice in real life. So I want to share this one. Okay, this is my emulator, my Android emulator that runs on ice cream sandwich. I start the application. I select the sample, and I can connect to my local repository. Just to note, it's not necessary to bind to a CMIS URL. Just provide the Alfresco context, and it's possible to connect to your Alfresco instance. So I click on connect, then I have a list of all samples that the sample project, the sample application provide. I will start with browse activities. So this list view provide all the information about the activities. It's like the same as we provide in Alfresco server. And as you may know, this list view is a fragment, and this fragment can be incorporated into your application as is, at no cost, with no modification. So it's very easy to add it to your application. Next, I want to show you that it's possible to have a list of all your seeds inside your Alfresco repository, or maybe just the seeds that I am member of, or maybe just the seeds where I favorite it inside an Alfresco. So in my seed, I want to go to the sample seed, sample Alfresco team seed. In this one, you can see that it's possible to browse. We support what is called I don't remember the word, the paging. So if, for example, there's more than 10 or 20 items, it's possible to have the notion of paging and let's appear the button of loading more if necessary. So what I want to do is create a new folder. So for example, in the test folder, I create it, it's refresh. Inside it, I want to upload a document, a file, an image that is stored inside my device. So for example, I'm going to pick an image, this image. I can rename the picture. I can add a description if I want, it's optional. And if I want, I can add tags and pick some tags if necessary. So I have the list of all my tags that are present. I can filter it. If I want, I can choose some of them. And I can confirm. Okay, it's uploaded. And now I have access to the details page of my uploaded document, uploaded image. I have access to the version number, so to all properties that this object have. So for example, title, we can see there's the description is taken in account. If I want, I can show the list of tags. I can have access to the version history of this document. And of course, if I want, I can comment it. And add it as is to the document. I can download it again, if necessary, and open it with the application that can read this file tab. So for example, an image with a gallery view inside my device. I can like it or unlike it. And I think it's pretty all for the file action. So what is possible to do is to browse, of course, the company home. For example, the version history, I can have a lot of lists of versions if necessary. And then the last thing I want to show you is the search. So for example, if I search on Android, I can choose if I want to search in full text and with exact term. And here I have the list of all items that have Android in full text and in Excel. The last thing I want to mention is in the home screen of the application, you have access to two other buttons, that is API reference, that is linked to docs.alfresco.com and directly to the future available documentation on Alfresco Mobile, and of course learn more, that is talked about what's the Alfresco vision about mobile and our applications that are available. So let's just finish with a last slide. In which case should I use the SDK? We identify three main use cases. If you want to create an application from scratch, you can use, extend, and customize the sample application. For example, you can change image resource or add some new services. If you already have an application and want to add some new and cool fragments, you just add the library project to your current Android project. With that, you can use and extend the fragments we provide. And if you already have all mechanisms to manage fragments, loaders, list view, but you need a simple mechanism, a simple library to retrieve all data from Alfresco server, you can just use the foundation services and the repository API. Okay, this was the last slide for the Android part. To conclude, I have just one question. Are you ready to level up? Thank you.
So Jean-Marie, I guess if people want to grab the lowest level of your stack, that would be the Android Open Seamless piece, and that they can get from Apache Chemistry. But where would they, will the higher up in the stack, the Alfresco pieces, will that be in the Alfresco SVN, or where will they get that code?
The Apache Chemistry has the Android part for OpenCMIS. It's available on Chemistry SVN, so it's available on Apache SVN. And the part for our application, for our open source, will be available inside the Alfresco SVN.
Okay, great. And then what about documentation? You mentioned that briefly there at the end with the link to documentation, but I noticed, unless I'm having a hard time finding it, there's not a lot on the wiki right now on the mobile stuff in general.
So the main part will be available inside the docs.alfresco.com for the official part. We are going to release new wiki pages inside the wiki.alfresco.com in the near future, when we will release the first version. And I will provide some new and simple tutorials in my blog and inside the Alfresco blog too. Okay, great.
Maybe after you switch over to Peter, maybe you could paste your blog URL into the chat so that everyone can see that. That would be great.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jean-Marie. This is Peter now speaking, and I tried to make it as interesting as Jean-Marie made it for Android. So this is about the Alfresco Mobile SDK for the iOS platform. So for all of those of you who are developing applications or components for the Macintosh platform, including iPhone, iPad, and iPod Touch, So I'm going to talk about that a little bit over the next few minutes. So first of all, let's go quickly through the list of stuff that we will include once we release the software to you. So like Android, it will have a sample application, and the sample application I will demonstrate towards the end of my slides, or after I reach the end of my slides. And the main purpose here really is to demonstrate the use of the API in your code in an example iOS application. But the corner piece, of course, is the mobile API library itself. And this is probably where most of the differences between the Android and the iOS platform will be, whereas the Android offering will have a number of jar files that we will distribute, and as Jean-Marie very nicely pointed out, in the iOS case, you will get a static library with public header files, which will in fact include the Objective-C library. So the purpose of that being is that you can then import it very easily into your Xcode project and start developing right away. So I will talk a little bit about the structure of the library in a minute. We will also include documentation. For those of you who are familiar with Java, there's a Java doc, which is a great tool to produce documentation from comments, and there's something similar available for the iOS platform, or for Objective-C, I should say, which is called AppleDoc, and it produces documentation as a docset file, and also, which I haven't mentioned here on the slide, but it's also going to be HTML-based, which has the look and feel of all the Apple documentation that people might be used to when they see that in Xcode or on the web. So before we go on, let's talk a little bit about the minimum requirements. Android, of course, has a lot more platforms and hardware to cater for, so with iOS things are a little bit easier, but things have moved on quite a bit. So with version 5 of the iOS platform, there are a number of introductions that we thought are very useful to utilize in an SDK, and therefore we decided the minimum requirement is iOS 5 and upwards, which shouldn't be too much of a restriction, bearing in mind iOS 6 is actually just around the corner, and iOS 5 has been in the market for quite some time. But the main reasons really are that with iOS 5, Apple introduced something called the automated reference counting. It is to some extent backward compatible, but not completely. And to get the full support which we would need for our API, you would need iOS 5. The other reason is JSON. So if you interact with the repository, you get JSON data back. In previous versions of iOS, you had to rely on third-party applications. Nowadays, you can actually build upon the code that is natively available in iOS platform. So the third reason is mainly only for the sample app. So another great innovation from Apple is the storyboard, which is basically they refactored the way you do interfaces and build interfaces in iOS away from nib files. Xcode is the main tool, by far not the only one, but I mean it is for iOS developers usually the tool used for developing iOS applications, and in fact any Mac application. And we would recommend that you use Xcode 4 upwards. At the moment it's at 4.3.3. So Jean-Marie's given us a great overview of Android application and how they're structured and how they're built and what the key components are. I'm not going to do the same for iOS for a simple reason, because the classes, apart from the sample app, which is an iOS-specific application, of course, but the mobile library is using core foundation classes. So we've taken great care of not including anything that would restrict people to develop applications only for iOS platform, even though that is the main thrust of our activity at the moment. But some people might be interested to develop applications for Macintosh. And I think there's one of our colleagues who has actually used the SDK recently for a Mac OS X project, and that worked fine. Let me just move to the next slide. Okay. So the first thing you will notice is that the word libraries, right? On the first slide I mentioned library. We distribute a single static library. So what is this library all about? Well, the library that you probably as a developer will care about is the one on the left, which is highlighted in orange, which is the Alfresco Mobile SDK, which incidentally also wielded a name, and its public headers. And this is where we will do all the heavy lifting of the asynchronous handling of requests for downloading and uploading documents. Of course, it also will handle all the additional Alfresco services. Gavin showed us an overview at the beginning of the talk of what these services are, but I just highlighted them here again. It's comments, tagging, rating, and activity. There are other services like the person service. And we encapsulate low-level seamless calls so that you don't have to actually catch up on seamless on the content management interoperability services standards. So that's actually shielded away from you. But under the hood, the library actually has another component which is in fact built on Objective-C, on the seamless library, which we ported over from Java to Objective-C. And this part of the project is in fact collaborative, so it's not restricted to Alfresco alone. There are other companies involved, and in fact, because Seamless is part of the Apache project, we have a member from the Apache project working with us. And the plan is to make that Seamless library available to the Apache project in due course. So later on this year, well, obviously after sufficient reviews. And the libraries, the Seamless libraries, handles all the standard Seamless stuff like creating sessions, requests, and services. But since it is synchronous, it makes sense to actually wrap this up in an asynchronous wrapper, so which is what the Alfresco Mobile SDK will provide. So I listed here 2 libraries, but in actual fact for you, it will only be one visible. This is a public API, the Alfresco Mobile SDK public headers that we'll make available. Okay, so let's move on to a little bit more nitty-gritty bits about iOS specifics. So as I said earlier, I'm not going to go into any detail about how to develop an iOS application. I think that's probably a talk for another day. But just suffice that there are a number of that would be different, and you would expect them to be different from Android. So one of them, for instance, is the naming convention. So we try to follow, well, as much as we could, to follow the standards that Apple sets for naming classes and methods. You will notice that in Android you have the very nice option of creating packages. So like org.seamless. Your class name or whatever the package might be. In Objective-C, you have to do that slightly differently. So all the mobile SDK code will be prefixed with Alfresco, and the Objective-Seamless code prefixed is prefixed with Seamless. That will be relevant once we make the Seamless library public to the Apache project, where people will be able to see the code. So, for instance, if you have a document folder service in Objective-C, you would find a class that's called Alfresco Document Folder Service. So, to give you an example. Another difference that some people might find surprising when they're moving from Android over or Java to Objective-C and iOS in particular is the lack of exceptions. So in Android, you would use something like try and catch phrases. For instance, if you do file handling or network handling or database handling. In iOS, you do that in a different way, and you use that mainly because you don't want the application to exit, not the mobile applications. Try and exceptions are available for Macintosh, but in iOS they're frowned upon because the emphasis is to exit an application gracefully. And the way to do this is to use NSArrow, which is a class that is part of the foundation. In any Alfresco method that you will use, you will see this class being used quite extensively, and we would advise everybody to check its value of return. The Apple standard is that if you get a value nil back, then the method call has been successful. Otherwise, you will have to do some error handling. But I will show you some example later on. Another one is automatic reference counting. Now, what is that all about? I mean, in the days before automatic reference counting, you had to actually be quite careful about retaining a handle of your objects and releasing them so you don't clog up memory leaks. And there were three methods that any class had available: so retain, release, auto-release. And with automatic reference counting, you can forget about that, because that is done under the hood for you. As I said earlier, for most of the parts, it would be backward compatible with iOS 4, but there are aspects, like for instance weak references, which if you use the iOS 5 nomenclature wouldn't be. So that is something that is for iOS 5 onwards, but anybody who's using iOS development, I would use to actually migrate to iOS 5, because there's a great advantage to do that. People who developed iOS applications previously know what headaches that did cause the reference counting and making sure that you release your objects without crashing application. But the main emphasis on the slide, so last but not least, is the use of blocks. So blocks is an interesting one because we use it quite extensively in the mobile API, and we use it in the context of handling requests and callbacks asynchronously. So like the Android API, so all the network traffic should be done asynchronously, because you don't want the user to tap on, say, give me this document, and then wait endlessly before actually you get a whole list back, or you get a list of folder back. So with asynchronous callbacks, you can handle that quite nicely, but you need to obviously deal with the fact that once the call does complete and you get a response back, your application needs to be able to handle that. And the way we decided to do that in iOS is to use the block mechanism. There are different ways, but I mean, block mechanisms sort of seem to be quite the cleanest way of doing this. So let me talk a little bit about that, because that is probably quite unique to iOS, at least in that context. So here's a little diagram of how this asynchronous handling is done, so there shouldn't be too much surprising. And here, so on the left side, you see your sample application in your iPhone, and the black thing is the code that you would like to execute once your call has completed. So let's say you want to create a session, and you pass this request onto the repository, and you want to know that, yes, the session has been created. So all that activity is being routed through to the Alfresco API on the main application thread. So as per usual, but under the hood, the the Alfresco SDK is creating a background thread to route that request through to the repository and get the response back. And then the response is then filtered through back to the main thread, and this is where the block structure comes in. So blocks are just a quick recap. The blocks were introduced with iOS 4 and Macintosh OS 10 version 10.6. Basically what a block is, it's just a piece of code that you can pass into methods and classes like a parameter, and you can in fact declare it as a parameter. And that's a great tool to have, because you declare the code that you want to do once a call completes, and you pass it on to the method. And the Alfresco Mobile API doesn't really care what you do with it, but it will execute it once the call completes. So, and this is the way that we handle the asynchronous callback in the Alfresco API. So let me just demonstrate this with a little bit of code here. So if this is the first time you see Objective-C, then I hope you will not be overly overwhelmed by this, where the syntax can be rather weird for people who've never seen that before. But what we're doing here is very simple. We're creating a session. So the first line that you will see, you will get an URL object. So which is created out of an HTTP string that you pass in. But the main activity here is in the line that starts below that, where we're using an Alfresco repository session class. So that's an example of how classes in the Alfresco Mobile SDK would be named. We connect with URL, and we pass in the username and the password. But we also, in this funny chap that is here highlighted in bold, which is the completion block. And in here you see that it takes two parameters, the session and the error object. Right? And this is the code that you would fill out, and this is the code the Alfresco API would execute once the call is complete and returns complete. So you will see here, for instance, also an example of how to do the error handling. Right? So you can check the error value. So this is just a very simple way of showing how blocks are being used in the Alfresco API. When you look at the code of the sample SDK, of the sample app that we will distribute with the SDK, you will see more of that. You can also do nested blocks, and I will go through that in a second when we go through the demonstration, which I think it is now time for.
Peter, before we do the demo, can you have a few minutes for a couple of questions that have come in?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I saw that a couple of questions were being fired up. Okay, go ahead.
All right, so the first one is from Bindu, who's asking if there's any plan to add CocoaPod packaging. I'm not familiar with CocoaPods, but he provides a URL, cocoapods.org, so I have no idea.
Yes, there is. It's on the backlog. This is Gavin, sorry, rather than Peter. Yes, that's on the backlog to be done, and we plan to add that in. So it's a simple sort of packaging mechanism for iOS. So it's similar to Maven in a way on the Java side, where you can just you can provide some files, and then other people can integrate that library into their projects fairly easily. So yes, we are planning to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. The next one is from Shai. Shai is asking if there are ways to leverage NF managed objects via core data from cloud storage.
Currently, no.
No, there isn't really.
But it'd be interesting to know. It'd be interesting to know why he asked that question, though, because that would be something to consider for the future. So if there's a way to get the contact details for Shai, then we can follow up with that.
Okay. And this one is sort of a higher level HTML5 versus native apps question, which is, in general, what is the this is from Jeff, not me, but different Jeff. Why would you use a mobile SDK that is designed for specialized devices instead of using something like HTML5 that seems to be gaining traction on mobile devices?
That's a great question, and I think the battle between doing mobile application natively and web applications has been actually raging for quite some time. So there are benefits for both, right? I mean, obviously, if you do a mobile application based on HTML5, you have a very thin layer of native footprint. So, I mean, in iOS, you would basically just build it on a UI web view, which is natively supported. It's very thin layer. You can even do without any kind of native code at all. And HTML5 has made great advances over the last year or so when with things like jQuery mobile, where you can in fact make it look alike or make it look closer to a native application than what you could have previously. The downside, of course, is performance. So it depends on what your application really needs to do. So there is a graphics performance that is still not quite as close to when you have a mobile application that it runs natively on the device. So, I mean, if it is something that doesn't require a lot of processing, then yes, I think there is a case to be made for doing it as an HTML5 application. Otherwise, I think there still is a lot of benefits to do that natively, particularly if you have graphics in terms of content. For instance, if you have an image library, for instance, and you want to do some image processing, there are ways to do that now in HTML5, particularly with libraries like PhoneGap. Also, I think from a performance point of view, you would find that it's lagging behind.
Yeah, and I would add to what you're saying, which is just that if you wanted to do an HTML5 app on top of Alfresco, there's certainly nothing from stopping you to do that. And in fact, there are some people that have libraries that make that a little bit easier. So if you're just, if you looked at Peter's slide of Objective-C and you're running out of the room with your hair on fire, then if you'd rather, or if your app would just work better, if you can meet your requirements better with HTML5, then you can certainly do that. And as a plug, we'll have an HTML5 on Alfresco topic at DevCon, so come to DevCon and learn more about that. I'm going to go ahead and let you do the demo, but I'll throw a question out there for, I think it's probably for Gavin, for you to address after the demo, which is sort of about what is the general purpose of our mobile apps. One of the questions that has come in is, does the mobile SDK let me work with rules, like creating rules, and does it let me work with workflows, for example? And so I think it'd be interesting to sort of get a feel from you, Gavin, on how much of Alfresco's functionality are we going to expose to mobile devices over time. So I'll let you think about that one while we watch the iOS mobile SDK demo here.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question that I have for you guys, can you see my screen? So with the iOS simulator on it?
Yes, it looks great. I almost picked it up and started texting with it.
Okay. So, right, okay, so the front screen looks actually the same as what Jean-Marie showed us. So I'm going to show, because we're probably running a little bit out of time now, but I'm going to show you just a few highlights here. So when you go to the next view, you will see something very similar. Well, in fact, you will see the same thing that you would get on the Android version. But the one thing that I wanted to highlight, following what I just talked about with the block structures. So let's go through the activities here. So you see the activities here listed, and that is quite a good example if you go into the code. And if I haven't frightened you to death with the Objective-C stuff that I've just shown you on one slide, then please have a look at that once it's public. So what's happening here is actually two calls to the repository under the hood. The first, of course, is to get the list of activities, which you see here in a simple table view, right? So when I scroll up and down. But under the hood is also you're getting these little icons here on the left side. I think because the user has always been the same here for a while. So here we have another icon, which is what we call the avatar, which is basically the thumbnail picture that a user can have. But this is example code, so we only have boring pictures, and you don't want to look at me anyway. So this is a different call that you do. So you have two calls which are nested. So you have, if you remember the slide that I showed you earlier, where you make a call to the repository, say, give me the comments, and in the callback, which is in this completion block, you can then make another call, a nested call, that gets you the avatars. So that would be a good example of how you could use the block structure to your advantage. Of course, you don't have to nest it, you can use convenience methods. So that might be worthwhile looking into when you actually look at the code. The other ones that I can quickly show you are the bits sort of which are fairly similar to what you would get with the iOS applications and with Android. So you get some basic search figures, and you then get a listed detailed view of the documents. There's a class in that sample application that does the job for you, where you can browse the metadata, and you can browse the comments. You can add another comment to it. Right, and you get the tags and the version lists, and you can obviously download it. So browse the folder again. Aligned with the Android app, which was great to show you paging. So paging, of course, is a way that we facilitate on the iOS side as well, which you can configure to your heart's content. So you can press on load more, and then you can sort of get everything on your screen. And as for the rest, you can browse all the sites. So basically, the sample application that we would deliver to you, together with the documentation and the tutorials, should give you a good way to get started on an iOS application development, or in fact on a Macintosh one. So should you so wish. And Objective-C isn't that hard to learn, so I pray that nobody here gets discouraged by looking at a bit of Objective-C code. But if you do, so there are great tutorials out there as well. So thank you for listening.
Is there so here's another question from Nicholas, is asking if there's any plan to do an SDK for boot to Gecko?
No, there isn't. The only plans we have at the moment is for the Android SDK and the iOS SDK.
Okay. Cool.
But feel free to fire that request off to product management.
Okay. So do you want to take a stab at the question that we posed before the demo, which is about just how much Alfresco functionality will ultimately be exposed in mobile devices?
Yeah, so the SDK in the first release is scoped to the functionality that we have in the iOS app right now on the App Store, the 1.2.2 version. So pretty much what we've seen in the sample, in the demos of the samples out there, sort of shows pretty much the full suite of functionality that we're exposing right now. Obviously, with the SDK being the basis of all our apps going forward, as we add more functionality to each app, the SDK features should be coming fairly soon, so that will probably be in the second release of the SDK, I would imagine. As for rules and more sort of low-level permissions and management stuff, there's no plans on the roadmap for that right now. But again, fire things off to product management to to get features on the roadmap for us to look at, that's fine. But just sort of the general, as we add features to the mobile app, basically they'll be added to the SDK. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, obviously rules are going to fire if you create documents from your mobile devices, but
that's right. Yeah, sorry, rules was mentioned, wasn't it? Yeah. So all the sorry, Jeff. All the server-side stuff will fire. So anything in the repository, any rules you have set up, if you add a file, upload a file from the mobile client, then all of that's going to be functional, yes. But you can't, there's no way to manage rules or create rules from the mobile SDK.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. So
if I could touch on something to add to that HTML5 question earlier as well. I think someone also mentioned in the chat that there's some of the low-level hardware access is also another reason to go with the native approach rather than HTML5. And one of the things that we've, one of the sort of big features of 1.3 that will be coming out any day soon is security. So encrypting data on the device. So that's something that was swayed us heavily towards the native approach.
Yeah, that's a good point. So that when people are using the Alfresco Mobile SDK, even when they download content, that content still stays on the device.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, I have another question that I would like to address from Bindu again about paging and whether we are getting browsing results back from the repository. So the way that it works, at least in iOS, is, I think across the board, is that you configure it to how big your page should be. So there is a default setting that in iOS we provide, which I believe at the moment is set to 50 items. But you can change that to any value that you would get. You would not lose the information, right? So you would not get a subset. You would get a subset, obviously, of the objects that are contained on that page, but you would get a handle to get to the next one and sort of iterate your way through the entire list. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. Well, we are a few minutes over our time here, so I do want to thank you guys for taking time out of your day to spend with us here on Tech Talk Live, and remind everyone to join us again August 1st. And this has been cool. This is interesting. I think this is going to open up a lot of the mobile SDK opens up a lot of options for people to create some really cool content-centric apps on mobile devices.